more organically considered dialectical form of thinking. Notoriously, he here appeals to contradiction to capture the vitality of thought. In the history of logic, what is appropriately called the law of non-contradiction is commonly called the law of contradiction. But when Hegel appeals to his law of contradiction, the title is apt. The law that Hegel calls the law of contradiction states that everything is contradictory. It is a law, Hegel says, that expresses the truth and essential nature of things. Robert Brandom, like many other defenders of Hegel before him, claims that this thesis does not entail the denial of the law of non-contradiction. Quite the contrary. Hegel radicalizes it, he says, and places it at the very centre of his thought. Of course, those philosophers who have claimed that with his law of contradiction, Hegel does actually deny the law of non-contradiction, have for the most part regarded this as amounting to a type of reductio of his own philosophy. Not all defenders of Hegel, however, have been as sanguine about the law of non-contradiction. Contrast Brandom's approach here with that of Graham Priest, who regards Hegel as one of the first philosophers to adopt an appropriately critical attitude to the otherwise dogmatically held belief in the truth of the law of non-contradiction. For Priest, not only does Hegel question the law of non-contradiction, he denies it. But while this would be sufficient to damn him in the eyes of most, Priest defends Hegel on just this count. Hegel's position is consistent, he claims, with the existence of systems of paraconsistent logic, logical systems which tolerate contradictions such that in them it's possible to have true propositions of the form P and not P. Priest is a radical paraconsistentist in that he thinks that not only are there possible worlds in which contradictions can be true, there are true contradictions in this one, a position which he calls dialethism, and he claims Hegel just for this position. Now, Priest's approach has the advantage of taking Hegel at his word when he avows his law of contradiction. Moreover, by linking Hegel's alleged dialethism to the issue of thought's limits, Priest locates Hegel's avowal of contradiction in just that part of the Hegelian program where his complex relation to Kant is perhaps most significant. Kant had claimed that reason has limits, that it nevertheless is necessarily driven to go beyond, and the cost of being so driven is that it entangles itself in contradictions. The contradictions explored famously in the Antinomies of Pure Reason in the transcendental dialectic of Kant's first critique. So, in the introduction to the science of logic, Hegel describes as, quote, among the greatest merits, unquote, of Kant, that he in fact freed dialectic, quote, from the seeming arbitrariness which it possesses from the standpoint of ordinary thought, and exhibited it as a necessary function of reason. The general idea on which he based his, Kant's, expositions, and which he vindicated, is the objectivity of the illusion, Kant means what he calls the transcendental illusion, and the necessity of contradiction, which belongs to the nature of thought determinations, unquote. Now, Kant, of course, did not embrace contradictions generated out of the operations of reason, and he did not draw Hegel's seemingly metaphysical conclusion, that of the contradictoriness of all things. Rather, he saw this feature as marking the limits within which reason had to self-consciously restrain itself, in some ways at the expense of foregoing the type of thought that had been traditionally thought of as metaphysics. But if, as Hegel famously claimed, one cannot have a determinate concept of such a limit without having already transgressed it in thought, then Kant's cautionary position could surely not hold. From Kant's perspective, in denying the positive aspect of contradiction, Kant himself was inconsistent. So for Hegel, the contradiction internal to reason that Kant had revealed had to be grasped, as he said, in its positive aspect. And this positive aspect was, quote, nothing else but the inner negativity of the determinations, the thought determinations, as their self-moving soul, the principle of all natural and spiritual life, unquote. Hegel, says Priest, quote, above all philosophers understood the dialectic limits of thought, unquote. Now, for the purposes of a defence of Hegel, one disadvantage of Priest's dialectic interpretation, in contrast to that of Brandom, lies in the sheer radicalness of the position to which Hegel is assimilated. Denying the law of non-contradiction, it is often said, undercuts the possibility of rational debate by removing its key logical condition, adherence to the law of non-contradiction. Very sort of specifically, they have included a couple of letters by David Lewis declining an offer to publish in a volume edited by Graham Priest on the law of non-contradiction, in which he says more or less that. Moreover, the fact that much of the motor of reason in Hegel has precisely to do with the removal of contradictions of the form P and not P, seems to testify to the normativity of the law of non-contradiction for Hegel, supporting Brandom's approach. However, I suggest that focusing on Hegel's attitude to the law of non-contradiction expressed in modern terms doesn't really capture his attitude to contradiction, and that Hegel's meaning is masked if one approaches his logical claims exclusively from a type of modern post-Fregean, fundamentally propositionally based approach to logic, and ignores the irreducible role given to aspects of Aristotelian term logic in Hegel's own logical thought. So here's the sort of right-hand turn in some sense. In fact, when we turn to Aristotle's logic, it would seem that Aristotle himself could not have meant exactly what modern logicians mean by contradiction, and so could not have intended exactly what modern logicians mean by the law of non-contradiction, at least to the extent that modern logicians tend to regard contradiction as involving the conjunction of a proposition with its negation. Hegel was no classical Aristotelian, but rather attempted in the realm of logic, as elsewhere, to reconcile what he saw as antithetically opposed aspects of modern and ancient thought. Not to replace, as it were, ancient thought by modern thought, but somehow to resolve the dispute. But this means that he was enough of an Aristotelian to reject an exclusively modern conception of contradiction. To this extent, then, I think that it's misleading to say, as Brandom does, that Hegel radicalizes and places at the very centre of his thought the law of non-contradiction. In some sense, it's true, but misleading. Nor does this formulation shed light on what Hegel actually means by the claim that everything is contradictory. Well then, what might this claim mean? At first glance, Hegel's formula seems primarily an ontological rather than a logical one, concerning as it does the contradictoriness of all things rather than of judgments or propositions about them. In this sense, then, Hegel would seem to adopt a position that's more comfortably associated with Aristotelian logic than with contemporary logic. In a recent survey of approaches to contradiction, Patrick Grimm has noted the existence of such ontological approaches besides semantic, syntactic and pragmatic ones. On an ontological outline, he notes, a contradiction would be neither a single statement nor a pair of statements, neither a proposition nor a pair of propositions, but a state of affairs, unquote. As examples, he gives the following. Aristotle's claim in the Metaphysics that, quote, the same attribute cannot at the same time belong and not belong to the same subject and in the same respect, unquote. And the description given by Richard and Valerie Routley that, quote, a contradictory situation is one where both B and not B, brackets, it is not the case that B, close brackets, hold for some B, unquote. Now, linking Aristotle's formulation with at least this one offered by the Routleys here is, I suggest, misleading. It's significant that when Grimm himself expresses the ontological interpretation, he uses two ways of expressing the contradictory state of affairs. Quote, a contradictory state of affairs would be one in which something had a particular property and also an incompatible property, or in which something both had a particular property and lacked that property, unquote. The latter formulation, as with the other examples, appeals to the coexistence of a fact with its negation, some negative fact. But the former does not, at least not directly, as it only appeals to an imagined situation in which something possessed incompatible properties. And this way of putting the point, I want to suggest, is the way that's more natural from within an Aristotelian worldview, organised within the resources of a term as distinct from a propositional logic. Reversing Wittgenstein's famous dictum, we might say that for Aristotle, the world is a totality of objects, or more correctly, primary substances, rather than states of affairs or facts.